Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to Victober, celebrated BookTube event designed to cry up the Victorians who all readers tend to encounter and love. I certainly love them. I consider them to be the greatest exponents of virtually every field of human creative, scientific, or historical endeavor that's ever been done. And I have stumbled into a sort of informal Victober celebration of my own on this channel, which is to read you a Victorian poem every day. We've read a few. We're going to continue. The question that a couple of you have had in emails has been, well, what about great Victorian poems? You've read us some Victorian poems, but what about the ones that we all know? What about celebrated or great poems? We'll get to them. The month is still young. Today, I'm going to read you one that most certainly is not great. This is by a poet named Charles Turner, and it's called A Brilliant Day. And I chose it in part because I'm particularly happy today, and also because today is not brilliant. It's hot and humid here in Boston, but it's heavily overcast. It rained all last night, which the clouds have not dissipated yet, so the temperatures are still only in the mid-70s to 80 Fahrenheit, but it's 97% humidity, so it doesn't matter at all. Even in the morning when the temperatures were lower than that, were in the high 50s Fahrenheit, there was still that greasy, resinous feeling all over everything that happens when you're in tropical humidity for longer than a month. And this is now the 8th consecutive month where Boston has been in tropical humidity, so that icky, resinous feeling it doesn't allow you to appreciate the cool. And cool or not, the minute you move even an inch, you are drenched in sweat. Just drenched in sweat. I hadn't taken this into account when I had the AC units removed from the windows here at Hyde Cottage. I probably shouldn't have done that. AC units, among other things, dry out the air, and that would make things a lot more comfortable, especially since I am now convinced this pattern is not going to change. I'm convinced that despite its location, Boston is now in the tropics. So it's 97% humidity here, even though it's only 80 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's not a beautiful day. If you're going to have choking, sopping, living under a heavy blanket humidity, you at least want sunlight and warmth to go with it. Otherwise, you just have the misery of humidity without any of the payoffs, which I thought made reading a poem called A Beautiful Day all the better. This is A Brilliant Day by Charles Turner, who was born in 1808 and died in 1879. So he died when Victoria had been on the throne for a long time and still had a long time to go on the throne. He died in her reign. But he would certainly have been old enough to remember the evil uncles. He would certainly have been able to remember the Georgian era. Anyway, here's the poem, which is just a celebration of a brilliant day. That's all it is. I mentioned yesterday that the Victorians loved their nature poetry, in part because they felt like nature was slipping away from them. Oh, keen, pellucid air, nothing can lurk or disavow itself on this bright day. The small rain plashes shine from far away. The tiny emmet glimmers at his work. The bee looks blithe and gay, and as she plies her task and moves and sidles round the cup of this spring flower to drink its honey up, her glassy wings, like oars that dip and rise, gleam momently. Pure-bosomed, clear of fog, the long lake glistens, while the glorious beam bespangles the wet joints and floating leaves of water plants, whose every point receives his light, and jellies of spawning frogs, unmarked before, like piles of jewels seen. So it starts with O keen pellucid air, which ends in an exclamation point, and it ends like piles of jewels seen, ends also with an exclamation point. The whole thing is meant to be an exaltation. And you'll notice, if you listen even to my my New England accent reading that, you will notice the buried rhymes that are all throughout there. They're not explicitly confined to end rhymes. There are rhymes buried in midline all throughout there. At regular intervals, the scansion here is very pure, and it is meant to make the whole thing resonate on your brain as a song, in addition to any end rhymes. Like we have day, away, lurk, work, plies, rise, cup, up. So you have an alternating end rhyme, but there are rhymes buried inside the lines as well, and that always has a wonderful effect on the reading brain. And you'll also notice some ostentatious poetryisms. I don't particularly like these. I don't know why poetry ever thought to take on the airs to do that, but But nevertheless, you get gleam momently. Momently is not a word you've ever heard outside of this poem. It's not a word you'll ever will hear outside of this poem. It means briefly. No one ever uses it though. The writer thought, well, this is neat. That's all. And there's another one as well that I thought we saw. I thought we saw there was gleam momently is the big one, but there was another one, another invitation there, another. Sorry for the thunderous noise in the background. All right, well, I can't find it at the moment. But the other thing that I wanted to point out is the rather sharp-eyed observation of nature that's going on here, particularly in the observation of the bee, who sidles round the cup of this spring flower to drink its honey up, her glassy wings like oars that dip and rise, a gleam momently. And I have had occasion over this summer, when walking the bean, we have been out and about, and I have had occasion to walk past eye-tall, just riots of sunflowers and other garden flowers that people just grow all the way to the edge of their garden, so it's climbing up their fences so that I don't have to stoop at all. I can just stare at these things. And I have watched just enraptured for 15, 20 minutes at a time, just watching the bees going about their work in these flowers. I can easily picture that Charles Turner did that as well 100 years ago, 200 years ago. And the thing you notice when you watch them, first of all, the bees that I watched all summer long were not territorial at all. They didn't even notice that I was there. And they were clearly about their business, and that business was very intricate. There was no drinking. There was no drinking. But there was industrious work, and it was being carried out with an absolute methodical thoroughness that included communication between bees. And not rote instinctive communication either. Communication about things that the bee had never seen before and was communicating to a bee who could not at that moment see the thing the first bee was describing. The communication, I think, happens a lot by touch. I confess I don't know all that much about how bees communicate with each other, but I know that it's complex. I know that it is. Because it could include not only descriptions. The second bee clearly knew what it was going to encounter when it went with the first bee, but also calls to action. The first bee was not just describing something to the other bee, but was urging the other bee to follow, to come along and follow. Sometimes that request was refused. I noticed often the request was refused when it involved travel. So if the second bee was busy about its own nectar, gathering nectar, and the first bee came to it and not only described something, but described also that travel was needed to experience this thing, whether it was a faraway blossom or something else, usually I noticed the second bee would refuse. They had a choice in the matter, in other words. It wasn't a hierarchical structure. It was not a command. And that is exactly what they seem like oars that dip and rise. That's exactly what their wings seem to move like. Their wings very much do not flap up and down. When you watch them closely, you see that. There's very much more of, it's very close to an oar-like gesture. I like that a lot. I like the feeling that poetry can give you of being immediately present with the poet. I feel certain that this poet has stood and stared at flowers the way I have done, the way I did this summer. All the rest of the poem of the poet is unknown to me. Don't know this poet at all. Never read a book about him. Sure, there's never been a book about him. I don't know any of the details. Don't know who he knew. Don't know where he lives. But I know that, and that's pretty intimate. I love that. Absolutely love that. And poetry will do that if it's done well. So that's another minor nature poem for you for Victober. But we're going to move on. We will get to major poems and longer poems as the month wears on. So I will wrap this up for now. I will see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.